Hello, I'm Corinna Heron. This is the Monday Night Review. And welcome to episode 114 of the Monday Night Review. There's been a bit of a hiatus because my husband threw me a surprise 40th birthday party. I don't have birthday parties normally, and I have never had a surprise party. So this was a big deal, and it was lovely. And it happened last Sunday, and I don't drink, but I thought I'm just not going to stress myself out. I had people staying. And I was like, I'm going to give myself a week off podcasting so that I can hang out with my friends and celebrate being 40. But now the kids have had their first day back at school, and I've been working on this episode for a while, and it's pretty dark. So I'm quite keen to get it out the way. I'm in my office, which probably never looks this tidy, but because we have people staying, it's looking pretty tidy. Needs to have a good old sort out. I love September. I used to hate it, obviously, because of the start of school, but for me, I feel better about September than I do about a new year. I saw someone very sensibly saying that they think of January as a kind of mental fresh start and things, and September feels very practical, and I agree with that. So I'm definitely looking forward to the coming months and all the cases that I'm going to be looking at. Today's a really complicated one, and it's been on TikTok a lot. There's actually a Netflix documentary coming out on it. It first came to my attention from an article that I read a while ago, and I was sorting through loads of paperwork, and I found this article, and I was like, I'm just going to make notes on it and then throw the paper in the bin, and then I just thought, actually, I'm just going to go for it. So it's a really complicated case. Massive trigger warning for childhood sexual abuse. This one is really gritty. I'm going to leave out a lot of detail, but I am going to talk about some detail. And the reason I'm talking about some of the sexual abuse detail is this case is very much split into two camps, which we'll talk about when we get there. But I think in order to understand behind the scenes, it's important to understand quite what these people went through. But I will give you a warning before we talk about it so that you have a choice to fast forward. But if it's going to be something that's difficult for you to listen to, I completely understand that this is one to skip. It's really complex. It's well documented. It could do with a whole podcast series on its own. There probably is one. But I needed to keep my focus on wanting to give you an overall idea of the case. I listened to an audiobook on this that was 12 hours long that gives you every bit of detail of dialogue from the court and all of that, which is great. And I suddenly got panicked that I wasn't giving you all that information. But I really feel that that's not what this podcast is about. I want to give you an overview, and if it's something that really interests you, there is just loads that you can go and read and listen to and stuff. I will try and remember, I need to get better at this, at listing the links to the sources that I've used so that if there is something you're interested in, you can easily go and follow it. I have got a bookshop.org reading list that I'm adding to all the time. I will put a link to that below. Now, not only is this in the hopes that if you buy anything in the UK here, from there I do get a tiny bit of commission, but also because there's just loads of really good books, and I love reading and I love talking to people about books. I did work in publishing for 7 years, so if I just love being able to have somewhere I'm like, go and look, these are the true crime books. So I will try and remember to add those there as well. The case we're going to be talking about today is the Menendez Brothers. The sources for this are the Telegraph magazine article by Chris Heath, New York Post article by Joshua Rhett Miller, an LA Times article by Salvador Hernandez, the Menendez murders by Robert Rand, and Court TV. It was all televised, so you can watch quite a lot of it. And as I say, there's loads of people talking about it on TikTok, if that's your jam. And there's the Netflix documentary coming out. I think I saw somewhere that it was February 2024. And so, again, it's very tempting to wait until that's out, but maybe you'll listen to this episode and then you'll have like a rounded idea of the case before you watch the documentary. On the evening of the 20th of August, 1989, 45-year-old Jose and 47-year-old Kitty Menendez sit down in their living room to watch The Spy Who Loved Me. North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills is a lovely, swanky residential area. Jose is a successful executive for a film company. He's a self-made millionaire. He had escaped Cuba when he was 16 and worked his way up from being a dishwasher at the 21 Club in Manhattan while finishing his accounting degree at Queens College. He met Kitty in college and they married when he was 19. Jose spent the early 80s as the head of RCA Records and had a hand in signing bands such as Duran Duran, The Eurythmics and Menudo before they moved to LA for him to work in the film industry. I should say that I'm recording this at 7:10 at night. I do try and not record at night because my power of speech fails me, and I will try and edit as best I can. But I might stumble on my words a bit. So, on this warm 20th of August night, Jose and Kitty are supposedly watching the telly when they are attacked. Jose is hit by 4 shotgun blasts, left elbow, right upper arm, left thigh, and what would later be described in court as, quote, an explosive contact wound to the back of the head. Kitty was hit 9 times to her left breast, the right side of her face, her right hand, right arm, left thigh, twice in her left knee, and a blast through her left shoulder into the left side of her face, and the shot to her left cheek that shattered her skull. The couple's 2 sons, Lyle, 21, and Eric, 18, returned home just before midnight from a nearby cinema where they'd been seeing a Batman film. They are the ones who find their parents, and the dispatcher would say to her colleague as she handed the call over, quote, I have a hysterical person on the phone. And that hysterical person was Lyle. The brothers are so distraught when the first responders arrive that neither are properly questioned and all tested for fingerprints or gunshot residue. Lyle is more together than Eric, but probably because he's the older brother. He's trying to look after his younger brother who's kind of rolling around on the floor, on the lawn outside the house. And it would actually be 2 months before the police would speak to them officially that they were in a real state. A memorial service is held at the Directors Guild of America for the Menendez parents. Lyle delivers the eulogy. Jose's sister Marta opined that her brother had been killed because he refused to deal with the mob. And this is the original idea. There were some dealings with the mob, or Jose and Kitty were killed as an example to someone else. Jose, we'll find out later, was a pretty hardcore, mean businessman, and by all accounts, the new line of work that he was in was what I've heard described as by a few people as seedy. However, the overkill for the Menendez murders suggests much more emotion involved than a clean mob hit with a message. Anyone who knows about true crime will know that the mob often just do a shot to the back of the head. This was definitely not that. The story drops out of the papers, but the Miami Herald had sent Robert Rand on a mission to interview the family. They wanted him to do a piece that was more the history, the story behind the couple that were so brutally murdered. And on the 20th of October 1989, he arrives at the house. The 2 brothers are out playing tennis and a girlfriend gives him a tour of the Menendez homes. Now, he's already been in contact with Marta Cano, Jose's sister, and other members of the family. And when the brothers return, he speaks with both brothers unrecorded. They want to get to know each other. It's quite an intense thing to talk about. And he returns the next day to record his conversation. Lyle has been called away on business. to New York. So he has a recorded conversation with Eric. All of this he has in his book, which is a great book, but you feel like he is very close to it, Bob Rand, and so you get a lot of dialogue. So Rand and Eric spend about 5 hours together, and Eric talks lovingly of his parents, saying he would have died for them if he'd had to, and speculating about what would have happened if the brothers had been home that night. When Rand's story is published on Christmas Eve 1989, he would say of the brothers, quote, "Lyle wants to become president, Eric will settle for US Senate." They were ambitious, rich kids who believed the world was their oyster. And yet, in March 1990, Eric and Lyle Menendez were arrested for murdering their parents. Over the next 3 years, while they awaited trial, the stories in the media were of two brothers spoiled, greedy, and sociopathic. The story went that 2 days before the murder, they'd learned that their father was disappointed in they'd been caught burglarizing a couple of houses for fun. Eric had got in a fight. They weren't doing as their father wished, and he had disinherited them. So they then drove to San Diego to buy shotguns, and after the murders, they went on a spending spree. They bought restaurants, watches, cars. Lyle bought a Porsche. They both bought Rolexes. They spent over $1 million in the first 3 months. As Chris Heath says in the Telegraph article, quote, "The whole affair was commonly depicted as a dark parable about excess, privilege, and moral vacuity." Though the police had been asking questions, the big break came when Eric, obviously confused about the Hippocratic Oath, confessed to his therapist. And though the therapist didn't directly go to the police, they end up finding out from the therapist's disgruntled mistress, like in a Jackie Collins novel. She'd recorded them secretly. But in 1993, when the trial started, a different story unfolded. Both sons told in detail stories of sexual abuse at the hands of their father, and Lyle at the hands of his mother. Eric had been seeing psychologist Dr. L. Jerome Azil since he'd got into an alleged gang fight. And on the 30th of October, 1989, Azil received a voice message from Eric sounding really agitated and saying that he was suicidal. On the 31st, they arranged a meeting and Eric arrived for his appointment. Azil noted that he'd lost weight, and he talked about having terrible nightmares about his dead parents and the crime scene. He then said he wanted to go for a walk, so they went for a walk together, and for about 30 minutes while they walked, he talked about what a great man his father was. And then he leaned against a wall and announced, "We did it." They discussed the night of the murders in detail. Eric had seen a BBC documentary about how a son had killed his father, and decided that if he was going to kill his father, he'd have to kill his mother. She would never emotionally survive without her husband. And Azil's obviously distressed. He says he needs to speak to Lyle as well. He calls Lyle and tells him to come into the office. And Lyle arrives. Azil would later say that he found him menacing and threatening, telling Eric that we're now going to have to kill Azil because he knows. This is something that both brothers would strongly deny later. What makes all the difference in this case is Azil's personal life. He's married with children, and he's allegedly carried out a number of affairs with female employees, and he's currently in the throes of a relationship with Judelon Smith. It should be noted that after this, Azil is struck off and has his license revoked. Judelon Smith's version of events and Azil's would differ greatly, even when they were in court under oath. And it would be Smith that would turn the Menendez brothers into the police, claiming that she was in Azil's waiting room the whole afternoon and had heard the confessions, but she changes her story. In another version of events, she says that she taped them. In another version of events, she says that Azil came out of his office while they were waiting for Lyle to turn up and told her that Eric had just confessed to the murders. So important to remember that Beverly Hills was at the time averaging about 2 murders a year. So they'd had their annual quota in quite a dramatic murder in one night. So this was a big deal locally. Aziel, apparently fearing for his life and that of his wife and children and girlfriend, made arrangements for them to stay in the hotel, and things sort of disintegrate. This is a long, drawn-out couple of months, with Julon Smith saying that their relationship was still ongoing, him saying that he's trying to extract her from it. She has some form of emotional meltdown, and she actually ends up moving into the Aziel's house with his family. I don't think his wife knew at the time that her husband's mistress was living with them. But once she's there, she's supposed to stay for a couple of weeks. Once she's there, it's almost impossible to get rid of her. And Aziel finally manages to evict her. And it's when he evicts her that she goes to the police in a rage. Over the coming months, she records all the conversations with Aziel. And at times, she goes and meets him wearing a wire. All of this would come out in court. Lyle was arrested on the 8th of March 1990. Eric, who was in Israel at the time for a tennis tournament, hears of his brother's arrest, flies to Miami, and then to Los Angeles, where he turns himself into the police on the 11th of March with his aunt Marta Cano and her son Andy, who's very close friends with. The media immediately start speculating that these are two spoilt, rich brats who just wanted more money and sort of murdered their successful, defenseless parents. The police said they had suspected the brothers from early on. Obviously, the amount of emotion involved in the crime scene would point to someone who knew the couple. But the police had lacked the necessary physical evidence. Smith had told them that she'd heard the brothers tell Aziel that they had dumped the shotguns in the bushes near Mulholland Drive, but intense searches by the police had found nothing. It was during their first trial that the jury heard the story behind the closed doors of this seemingly successful Menendez family. Jose was forceful and dominating at work. He had the ability to make people feel small. His brother-in-law said Jose had, quote, an alarming lacking in compassion and respect for his colleagues and subordinates. He carried this over to his parenting, being controlling and demanding of his sons, wanting them to excel in business and tennis to the extent of being completely overbearing. He didn't want them to have any friends. He believed that this would be too distracting. The Canos, Jose's sister and her family, believed that Kitty had a drinking problem and didn't particularly care for her children. Peter Cano witnessed an incident where 5-year-old Lyle, who was running around the room kind of bonkers, was stopped by his father, who whispered something in his son's ear that made him turn pale and instantly wet himself. His father then punched him in the chest with a closed fist and sent him to his room. Peter objected and said, "You can't do that." And Jose said, "If you don't like it, leave," which the Canos did instantly. When Lyle was given a class rabbit to look after over the summer, this is a trigger warning, unfortunately, Kitty told him that he should get rid of the rabbit, that his father didn't want it, and Lyle hoped that his father would change his mind and was distraught to find the rabbit missing a few days later, and Kitty told her son that he needed to speak to his father. Jose told Lyle to look in the bin, and in the bin he found the rabbit beaten to death and covered in flies, and he was obviously distraught. Their sports coaches believed the boys would never be able to do enough to please their father. One time when Jose had been shouting at Lyle during a tennis match, Lyle had snapped at him to shut up. Jose had gone over, grabbed him by the throat and punched him in the face and said, "If you ever disrespect me in public like that again, I'll kill you." He was misogynistic, had no problem in showing his sons that treating their mother badly was acceptable, that he was king of his castle, that he was in charge of his house. He had affairs and reportedly told people that he stayed married to Kitty because she ran the house the way he liked. Kitty actually discovered his affairs, which made her more neurotic and depressed than she already was. She kind of stalked one of the women that he'd had an affair with. She also saw a therapist. She told her therapist that it was too painful to be alive. She was dependent on drugs and alcohol. And she began verbally lashing out at Jose in public. And actually, this was a sort of turn in their relationship because he took it. He would do anything to placate her. The children noticed a change in their relationship after she found out about the affairs because Jose sort of let her have more control, but not when it came to the boys. The boys got in trouble. Eric got in a fight with a gang. I don't believe it was a gang that Eric got in a fight with, but they believed it was. Jose managed to get all charges dropped. Lyle was asked to leave Princeton for a year, having been caught plagiarizing something. Again, his father was brought in and tried to get his son out of it and failed. And both times the children, Jose was cross with the school for treating their son like this. He wanted them to win. He wanted them to succeed. It didn't matter if they cheated. It didn't matter if they lied. They had to be the best. And it was around this time that with a gang of friends, they started stealing from friends' parents' houses while they were on holiday. So initially with the press, it was like they were burglarizing houses, and they were stealing. But what they were doing is they were going to their rich friends' parents' houses when their rich friends' parents were away and stealing stuff. They weren't breaking in randomly. They weren't master criminals. They were rich kids prattling about. So yeah, the boys were programmed to win at all costs. It didn't matter how they did it. They were treated as objects in their house to make their parents proud. They were never treated as adults. They were never nurtured. Kitty seems to have been more distressed about Jose's affairs than the abuse of his children, and would often tell Lyle that he'd ruined her life and she hated him. She had more of a rapport with Eric, but she, again, didn't act like a mother. She would record all of his phone calls so that she knew what he was doing at all times. He only found this out after she died. Now we're going to talk about the sexual abuse. So you should forward on it. I'm going to skip a lot of it, but it is still unpleasant to listen to. Lyle said his father began fondling him when he was 6, and this progressed to rape over the next 2 years before stopping. Lyle was told by Jose that this was bonding and it was normal between fathers and sons, and it was like Greek and Roman soldiers did before battle. Eric was told a similar story when he was 6, but the rape and molestation continued through to his teenage years, and in fact until his father's death. Jose would take baths and showers with his sons, something which was confirmed by witnesses in court. And when they moved house in Beverly Hills, the boys were horrified by the installation of this huge bathtub because they knew what would happen in it. Eric told the court how the first time his father ejaculated into his mouth, he spat it out and his father slapped him in the face. After he'd been molested by his father, he would often throw up in the bathroom next to his parents' room while his mother sat on the bed reading, not doing anything to help him. Lyle accused his mother too of molesting him well into his teenage years. Eric's lawyer would summarise it as a careful, calculated pattern of grooming the child for the father's sexual gratification. Though this was the 1990s and sexual abuse was seen much differently then, it's noted that Lyle wet the bed until he was 14, something that his parents penalised him for. Also, as Eric got older, his father would force him to perform oral sex whilst he pushed pins and tacks into him. Which is the thing, it seems really unnecessary to mention, but that is just an aspect of abuse that for me just highlights quite what these children were going through. 6 months before the murder, the sexual abuse on Eric started again. It had stopped, but this time there's no pretense that it's normal. It's a show of force and dominance. In May 1989, it's the last time that Eric was raped by his father. Eric said he just dreamed of going to college. That was his dream. He either wanted to go to Princeton, where he would live with his brother, or go to UCLA. And he gets into UCLA, and this is what he's been aiming for in his head: freedom. And in the days leading up to the murder, Jose had said to Eric, in fact, you will go to UCLA, but you will be living at home, quote, so we can keep an eye on your homework. But Eric knew that this meant that so the abuse could continue. 5 days before the death of the Menendez parents, on the Tuesday, Lyle had an argument with his mother, which resulted in her ripping off his hairpiece. It turns out that already by his early 20s, Lyle had started losing his hair, and his father had said that, you know, to be successful in business and to be successful in life, you had to have a good head of hair. So they had paid thousands of dollars to have this professionally done hairpiece, which is glued onto the top of his head. And Eric's in the room. He has no idea about his brother's hair loss, and he sees this and he's sort of traumatized. He's traumatized that he didn't know. He's obviously traumatized by a very shocking and violent act, and because he didn't know that his brother wore a hairpiece, one can only assume that when he saw this hair being ripped off his brother's head, he must have imagined that his mother basically scalped his brother. Eric goes to comfort his brother, and Eric says that I too have a secret, and tells Lyle about the ongoing abuse. Now, Lyle knew that there had been abuse of his brother, but he had said to his father years ago that it had to stop, and had assumed that it had stopped. So Lyle is furious. On Thursday evening, when Jose returned from a business trip, Lyle confronted him and said, you've got to stop, this is enough. And Jose says, he's not your brother, he is my son, and I run this family how I run it, and you have to stay out of it. Lyle said, quote, I told him he wasn't going to touch my brother again, that I would tell everybody everything about him, and that I would tell the police and I would tell the family. Jose seemed unmoved and left the room. And this is when Lyle began to think, he's not going to let me tell. He's going to put an end to me so that I cannot tell on him. Eric would then tell how his father confronted him later that evening and said that Lyle was going to tell everyone. Jose allegedly said, quote, I'm not going to let that happen. When Kitty saw her younger son was upset, she asked what was going on, and he said that she wouldn't understand. And she said, I understand more than you know. I've always known what's going on. Do you think I'm stupid? So again, horribly shocking to know that your mother has been complicit in this the whole time. It's the next day that the brothers will go to San Diego and buy the shotguns. It's not easy. I know I wang on about guns in America. They do go to various different places. They end up having to buy it with a friend's ID who would link to the puzzle, because obviously they track down that someone's bought these guns, but it's using an ID, and he's proved to be in New York at the time. And the night that they buy the guns, Eric lies on his bed holding the shotgun while his father bangs on the door demanding to be let in. At the time, they say they bought these guns for protection. They were convinced that their parents were going to kill them. The next evening, the family had another confrontation, and the parents go into the sitting room, close the door, Eric and Lyle believe that they're planning to kill their sons. They fetch their guns, go into the room, and they start firing. Afterwards, they waited for the police to arrive. They couldn't believe that someone hadn't heard all the shooting and called it in. When it became apparent that they hadn't, the brothers started to think about their alibis. And this was something that the defense mentioned. It was not a well thought out alibi. It was not, a sophisticated crime. They decided to say that they'd been to the cinema to see a film that they'd both already seen. They had actually then arranged to meet a friend. But by the time it came round to meeting the friend, Lyle had started to lose it. After they committed the murders, Lyle had kind of held it together. Eric hadn't at all. And Lyle had just been directing them. But obviously, as time passed, the adrenaline wore off. He then started to lose it as well. And both of them would say they kind of began to idealise their parents after their murder. They kind of couldn't believe that their parents could die. And so they returned to the house. Instead of meeting the friend, they wanted to meet the friend, take the friend back to the house, and then they'd all find the bodies together. But they decide they're just going to go back and find the bodies. And that's what happens. They phone the police. I think what's so telling about all of this is that Eric would go so far as to say that he found jail was quite relaxing. Quote, now we can't succeed. And I think that says a lot about what the young men had suffered. Is that even though for a while Eric was in a cell by himself, he'd got into a fight with a prison guard, he found that preferable, it sounds like, to what he'd been living like before. Eric and Lyle had separate juries, and both were hung, unable to decide whether the brothers would be tried for murder or manslaughter. The story of abuse was heard, and numerous witnesses came forward, including family members, to describe the rage and the general oppressive feeling in the house. Brian Anderson, Kitty's nephew, would tell of Kitty's rage. When he'd go and stay with them, he was like she'd suddenly just start gritting her teeth until her veins popped in her neck. The boys would be beaten with a belt. He also said that quite often Eric would be taken to his room by his father, and Kitty would forbid anyone to go near the room. Brian also said he found it weird how the boys showered and bathed with their father, and he noted the shocking change in Eric from this confident, happy, outgoing 4-year-old, and then the next time he saw him, he was this morose, withdrawn 6-year-old, and he was shocked by the change. He told how during one visit in 1976, he noted that Lyle was not allowed to cry. And another cousin, Diane, described a, quote, weird sexuality in the house. She worked for them as a housekeeper and a nanny, and there were a number of things that she cited as being very odd. They also heard from sports coaches who described their interactions with the Menendez family, and one actually broke down in tears as he described the schedule that the boys were put through as hostile and cruel. He said the reason he put up with Menendez and carried on was he felt like he was the only friend the boys had. Marta Cano told of how her brother could belittle and humiliate anyone who went against him, even family, and how Kitty actively disliked Lyle. She told of how even when Lyle was 2, he had to feed himself. He had to get up on the counter to get things out, to get out bread and things to feed himself. If Marta tried to help him, Kitty would say, you have to leave him. He's got to learn to do it for himself. There was never any affection shown. And actually both boys were very close to their aunts. Lyle takes the stand and was questioned for 9 days, telling some stories that are so shocking. One time, exhausted from relentless swimming practice with older kids when he's 6, his father insisted that he carry on and would hold his head underwater to build endurance. Kitty would tell Lyle that he'd ruined her life, and when he wet the bed, she would rub his face in the wet sheets and refuse to change them, making him sleep on the floor. His mother once cut herself deliberately with a kitchen knife, blamed Lyle, and then smeared her blood on his face, refusing to let him wash it off. Okay, trigger warning for this next bit. Eric's next to take the stand. He tells stories of sexual abuse that are really horrendous to listen to. Jose pushing tacks and pins into him whilst forcing him to perform oral sex. And one time when Eric was 17 and refused, his father held a knife to his throat and raped him. He told of the dismay at being told he would not be staying overnight at college and realising that his mother had known about the abuse all along. He also said that there had been times when Jose had watched violent porn in front of colleagues, friends, and children. And how in the days leading up to the murder, Kitty had told him, quote, "If you had kept your mouth shut, things could have worked out for this family." And in their strung out state, the boys were convinced that this meant that the parents were going to kill their children and they needed guns for self-defense. And they both would tell of a fishing trip that they went on with their parents that they tried to avoid going on. In the days leading up to the murder, they got home late. The parents said, "We're leaving at 3. They get home at 4. The parents are still there, so they all have to go. And the captain of the boat says he thought it was so weird how the two boys just sat in the front of the boat, huddled together, freezing, and not talking to anyone. And they were just convinced that their parents were going to kill them at any minute. And they weren't sleeping properly. For many, the belief was that the brothers had made up and rehearsed these stories of abuse to save themselves from the gas chamber. Dominic Dunn, who was at the trial as correspondent for Vanity Fair, would say, quote, two juries took the word of two world-class liars, two rich, spoiled, arrogant losers who were already on the road to a criminal life when they shot their mother's face off and their father's brains out. Interestingly, it's worth noting that Dominic Dunn later on would say that he believed Lyle's story of abuse, but that really, to me, sums up how the media were portraying Lyle and Eric Menendez at the time. The defense pointed out that though the Menendez parents didn't lavish their children with money, they did have money. They seem to have had the same amount of money as their other friends. And at 22, Lyle would have become executor of the estate, so within 6 months, he would have had access to the family money. Now, I'm not sure if this would have changed had Jose changed the will as he'd threatened, and he had spoken to Marta Cano about changing the will, and he had allegedly drafted another will, cutting his children out. But I believe that he would have changed it back. He wanted his children to be these kind of jock, successful, athletic, go-get-'em, money-making kids that they probably could have been had he not abused them in every possible way. There's no reason why they couldn't have. They come from a line of successful, athletic, clever people. There is no reason why these boys wouldn't follow in those footsteps had they been nurtured and looked after, and at no point were they nurtured or looked after. It was after this initial trial that controversial lawyer Alan Dershowitz coined the term the abuse excuse. The second trial began in 1995, a few days after O.J. Simpson had been found not guilty of murdering his ex-wife and her friend, which is a total travesty. The prosecution focused relentlessly on the gruesome murder scene and the fact that Lyle had deleted his father's new will from the computer. During the first trial, their cousin Diane Marie Hernandez testified that 8-year-old Lyle told her in 1976 that he was being molested by his father. But this evidence wasn't allowed in the retrials. The testimony of more than 30 people who took the stand at the first trial was excluded. The only person who testified about abuse allegations during the second trial was Andy Cano, who said that Eric had asked him when they were about 8 and 6 whether Andy's father massaged his genitals, and Andy had said, "My dad's absent. My parents are divorced. I don't know if that's normal." But Andy really remembered it. But the judge ruled that there's insufficient evidence that Jose had abused his sons at all, and so that wasn't taken into account. Lyle and Eric Menendez were found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Their wish to be in the same facility was refused, and for the next 20 years, they were not even allowed to speak on the phone. In 2018, Lyle was allowed to join his younger brother at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. And though the fact that the Menendez brothers shot their parents is indisputable, for some, the sentence, given the circumstances, seems disproportionately harsh. Richard Rand never dropped the Menendez stories. He visited them in prison. He published his book, The Menendez Murders, in 2018. And he believes their story of abuse in the beginning. And he has interviewed a lot of the family members, a lot of the people involved with the case. And he's also noted how opinions of sexual abuse have changed since the 1990s. And a lot of this comes down to, well, why didn't they tell people? You still have people now, it's 2023, you still have people who will tell you they couldn't tell anyone of the sexual abuse, either because the abuser had told them that they would hurt someone or hurt them, or that nobody would believe them, or that it was normal. So for men in the 90s with a rich, successful, overbearing father, there's absolutely no way they were going to tell anyone. And so therefore that limits the amount of witnesses you have. There's also all this bollocks about, oh, there are no witnesses coming forward who saw the sexual abuse. Well, no, he's doing it in their bedroom and in their bathroom. He's not asking for witnesses. Robert Rand is now an advocate for their release, and they've exhausted all their appeal options. So they either need a pardon or a commutation from California's governor, or they need to produce significant new evidence that could lead to a new trial. Now, as I said, Andy confirmed that when Eric was 12 and Andy was 10, Eric told him that his father had been touching him, massaging his genitals, and asked Andy if his father did the same. Andy, unfortunately, died a while ago. But Rand was allowed access to his papers by his mother, Marta Cano. And he found an original letter from Eric to Andy, sent 8 months before the murders, which included the following quote: "I've been trying to avoid Dad. It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I can't explain it. He's so overweight that I can't stand to see him. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. He warned me 100 times about telling anyone, especially Lyle." Another cousin remembered a weird rule in the Menendez house that when Jose was in the bedroom of one of the boys, no one was allowed to go down the corridor, and that after the tennis, the boys had to shower with their father, and after the shower, they would run into the bedroom and lock themselves in. This was to the extent that to use the bathroom, which was past the brothers' room, they would in fact have to go down into the basement, through the basement, up the other stairs to the bathroom. They were not allowed to go past the brothers' room. So whilst in prison, both brothers have married women that they had long correspondence with, and those women are acting as their sort of proxy to the outside world with Facebook pages and things like that. And there are, of course, people who believe that Eric and Lyle Menendez are spoilt rich brats who were pissed off that Daddy was holding the purse strings and are exactly where they deserve to be. An ex-prison guard who worked at the prison where Lyle was held says he was an entitled narcissist. It's amazing how Marmite Especially Lyle seems to be, where you have people who say he's awful, and then you have people who he mentored in prison who are now out and will say, I would not have gone straight, I would not have done this had it not been for Lyle Menendez taking me under their wing. Both, interestingly, have told their story with remarkable consistency for the past 35 years. And that is something that's really telling. You will catch people in lies because they can't remember the lie. But these stories now have not changed. The stories that they have also match, but not in a pre-rehearsed ways. They tell the same story, but from separate perspectives, without kind of knowing what the other brother is saying. Interestingly, also a testimony from Roy Rosello, a one-time member of Latin boy band Menudo, has come forward that says he was raped by Jose Menendez several years before the killings. And it says that the brothers acted in imperfect self-defense, and then they're guilty only of manslaughter. And if they're guilty of manslaughter, that means that their sentence should be reduced. So what do you think? Rich brats who are trying to escape the death penalty, or abused children who'd been so emotionally tormented that they snapped? I think the trauma they experienced after the murder sounds real. You can hear it in the 911 call, which I don't recommend listening to. I find it slightly dark. But, they're properly traumatized. And both of them said they sort of idolized their parents after they died and didn't want to break this facade of this perfect, Cuban refugee done good, successful businessman, successful family. They didn't want to let their father down. And I find the psychology of it all incredibly interesting. Is the abuse they suffered excuse for murder? Absolutely not. But is it a reason for it? Yes. People point to their 3-month spending spree after the death of their parents as showing that they are these bratty children who just wanted the money. But I think these are young men who have never not had restrictions put on them and never not had been under the thumb of their father. They've never had this freedom. And suddenly they can do whatever they like. And frankly, if you sent a 14-year-old boy out with access to millions of pounds, they're not going to make very good choices. And I do think that needs to be taken into account. I think anyone who has been controlled and abused and belittled and not had the emotional nurture that they need and the freedom that they need and the ability to be themselves, it's going to stunt them. When asked during the first trial why they didn't just leave home, they responded that they loved their parents. It just wasn't an option. And again, to me, that points to victims of abuse. It's almost like abused women who think that their abuser is going to change, or who is just too scared to leave because of the consequences if they get found, or who loves the person who has turned into this violent abuser. And they sort of, when you hear the quotes about it, you can see that it's just in their heads. They were so scared. They were so convinced that their parents were going to kill them. They kind of went through the looking glass, but just to up and leave was not an option. They loved their parents. They were good boys. They'd spent their entire lives trying to make their parents happy, going through such extremes to make their parents happy, that leaving must have just been a shocking thought. More shocking than shooting them. I think the Menendez brothers had been brought up being told that the abuse that they were going through was love, it was family, it was success. And they snapped, understandably. They wanted to make their parents happy, but they were so abused that they mentally couldn't process it, and they made a terrible decision. Should they be let out? I don't know. They are guilty of murder. And part of me is like, if you take someone's life, you should never get out. That you should give your life as you can for theirs. So that means being incarcerated. But part of me thinks these men had no chance, really. They had no chance. There was no escaping this torment. So that's the story of the Menendez brothers. There are loads more gritty details that you can get into. I just wanted to give you an overview of what is an incredibly complicated case, and one that is so interesting that it's still rumbling on in the media now, because people want them freed. They think they've done the time, but obviously there are people who believe that, they've made the abuse excuse. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm sorry for the content. I should say listener discretion is advised, like a grown-up at the beginning, but I'm yet to be a grown-up even at 40. You can buy me a coffee, you can check out my bookshop, you can join the Patreon where there's extra content, extra stories, little lovely bit of something to scroll through while you're having a cup of tea at work. You can buy t-shirts. I bought my husband a t-shirt for his birthday because he said I need a new t-shirt, and I was looking at loads of t-shirts online, none of which I loved, and I was like, I'm getting him a Monday Night Review t-shirt, and I have to say it's my favourite t-shirt that he owns. If you need inspiration for the man in your life, I got him a grey pink pod dog t-shirt, and it's pretty damn cool. Email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. Find us on social media, The Monday Night Review, on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.